You are listening to the Amateur Church podcast, where we pursue excellence in ministry with the right motivation for the sake of love. I'm Pastor Matt, and I'm so thankful that you are on this disciples journey with me this year. This week, we've been reading through the book of 2 Samuel and insight into the kingship of David, the most famous king of all Israel. And as we have seen this week through apologetic, theological, and devotional emphasis, we've seen his strengths and weaknesses, his successes and his failures. But one of the things that I want to bring out today as we talk about evangelism is, to me, one of the greatest stories of David and his kingship, and that is his kindness to Mephibosheth. Now, let me give you a little bit of background, especially as we look at an evangelistic emphasis. Mephibosheth was the son of Jonathan, the grandson of King Saul. David had, while Saul and Jonathan were still alive, made a covenant with Jonathan because of David's love for Jonathan, Jonathan's love for David, that he would show kindness to his children and his family, his descendants. And so we get in 2 Samuel chapter 9, while Saul and Jonathan had died, and David is now on the throne, we pick up in 2 Samuel 9 where it says, "Then David said, 'Is there yet anyone left of the house of Saul, that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake?'" So here's the picture I want you to get. A king who is reigning is seeking out, taking the initiative to show kindness to those who would, in other nations or other cultures, really be executed, because a descendant of Jonathan or Saul would be seen not as someone to show kindness to, but as a threat to the throne, an enemy of the king and of the throne. And yet David says, because of my love for Jonathan, is there anyone I can show kindness? Verse 2 says, "Now there was a servant of the house of Saul whose name was Ziba, and they called him to David. And the king said to him, 'Are you Ziba?' And he said, 'I am your servant.' And the king says, 'Is there anyone of the house of Saul to whom I may show the kindness of God?' And Ziba said to the king, 'There is still a son of Jonathan who is crippled in both feet.'" So when you go back and you see earlier in 2 Samuel, you get a little insight into Mephibosheth. If you go to 2 Samuel chapter 4, it says in verse 4, "Now Jonathan, Saul's son, had a son crippled in his feet. He was 5 years old when the report of Saul and Jonathan came from Jezreel, and his nurse took him up and fled. And it happened that in her hurry to flee, he fell and became lame, and his name was Mephibosheth." So, calling back to chapter 4, now in chapter 9, Ziba mentions Mephibosheth. And so it says, "So the king said to him, 'Where is he?' And Ziba said to the king, 'Behold, he is in the house of Machir, the son of Ammiel, in Lodabar.' And the king David sent and brought him from the house of Machir. And Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, fell on his face, prostrated himself, and David said, 'Mephibosheth.' And he said, 'Here is your servant.' And David said to him, 'Do not fear, for I will surely show kindness to you for the sake of your father Jonathan, and will restore to you all the land of your grandfather Saul, and you shall eat at my table regularly.'" In verse 10, it says, "Nevertheless, Mephibosheth, your master's grandson, shall eat at my table regularly." And then in verse 13, it says, "So Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. Now he was lame in both feet." Now, I want to take some time today looking at this, just 13 verses, that really is one of my favorite stories in all the Old Testament, because it is a picture to me of the gospel of Jesus Christ. In fact, I have regularly used this as an evangelistic tool to share the gospel with people. And I want to walk you through that today as we've read through this passage, that when we look at Mephibosheth, we see three very important days in his life that coincide with the kingship of David. The first day that was very important as a tragedy was the day that he fell. As we saw in 2 Samuel chapter 4, Mephibosheth fell on the day that the servant received news of Saul and Jonathan's death. In that day, at 5 years old, he became crippled, no longer able to walk, no longer able to do anything on his own in that culture. Likewise, there was a day that you and I fell, the day that Adam and Eve sinned in the garden, brought this sin nature to mankind, and we, separated from God, had this sin debt that we owe. And when we were born into this sin nature, knowing that we would have a destination called hell because of that. And yet, there was not only a day that Mephibosheth fell, but there was a day that Mephibosheth was picked up. Now, he was physically picked up in that day and carried around for the rest of his life. And yet, on this day that David has him brought to his house, Mephibosheth is, in a sense, picked up from his own life of where his father and grandfather had died, on life of where his health had been taken away. Mephibosheth is now elevated to another position. Think about this with me again, is that Mephibosheth should have been seen as an enemy of the throne, enemy of the crown. David should have had him killed. In any other culture, that's what would have taken place. But because of David's love for Jonathan, his love for God, and his promise, David shows kindness. There was a day in which God the Father showed us the greatest kindness and love by sending his son, Jesus Christ, to pick us up through the cross and through the resurrection from our sinful state, sin-sick state, in which you and I were destined for a place called hell. There was a day that Mephibosheth was welcomed in. There was a day that we were picked up and welcomed in. And I want you to consider that Jesus Christ died for us. We were enemies of the throne, children of wrath, enemies of God, according to Ephesians 2. And Christ left the throne room of heaven, sacrificed for us so that he might welcome us as part of the family. There was a day that Mephibosheth fell. There was a day that he was picked up and brought in. But then there was a day that he was seated at the king's table. And I love this. In verse 13, the very last verse, says that he lived in Jerusalem, for he ate at the king's table regularly. And now he was lame in both feet. He moved. Not only did his identity change, as a son of Jonathan, crippled, to now welcomed into the household of David, but his location changed. He was no longer at Lodabar, but he was in Jerusalem, for he ate regularly at the king's table. And this little emphasis at the end, he was lame in both feet. The culture dictated that no one in that type of situation had the right to sit at the table. But listen to me. There was a day where he was invited to the table and invited to the house to sit and feast at the king's table. There will be a day where we are invited to a permanent location, a new heaven and new earth, and feast in the presence of the king forever. And yes, we deal with our feet being lame as far as sinful, wretched creatures. But when Christ seated us at the table, we were created brand new, and no one can see under the table anymore. No one can see the feet that were lame. That we will have a new body. And in this day, though many might have risen up and said, David, don't you know who you've got at your table? Don't you realize he's a cripple? Don't you realize he can't give you anything or offer any political support? Don't you realize that it's a waste to serve him? That David welcomed him and no one could see under the table. That it was David's love for Jonathan and now love shown to Mephibosheth that welcomed this man who offered nothing to the king, offered nothing to the throne, and yet was welcomed just like a son. You and I, bringing nothing to salvation, nothing to Christ, nothing to God, have been welcomed into his family. And is this not the greatest evangelistic good news gospel? That we are Mephibosheth. We are the crippled, lame, and even worse than that, we were dead in our trespasses and sins, and God welcomed us. There was a day we fell. There was a day we were picked up. And there will be a day where we get to sit and feast at his table. And until that day in new heaven and new earth comes, we can experience abundant living, abundant life with him every single day. That's the gospel. And so may we be reminded not just to experience that, but now, out of love for Christ, to share that with others. As we conclude our evangelistic episode today, I want to share with you a throwback Thursday church history moment. And we have come to the year AD 590, in which a man comes to, he becomes Pope, and his name is Gregory. He becomes known as Gregory the Great. Gregory the First becomes Pope in AD 590. And just a little bit about him, you may have never heard that name, and yet he has influenced the Catholic Church and Christianity, honestly, more so than probably any other pope up to that point, especially. But then after, he was born in 540 to a family with great political influence and service. His entire family was heavily involved in politics. In fact, he became what was known as the prefect of Rome, which is the highest civilian office. And as he was in that role, a very humble man, a man who loved God, loved Jesus, he later joined a monastery as he had divided up his own wealth to give to different monasteries and establish places of worship. Even he became an abbot, and kind of just, even though he had political influence, he rejected that so that he could serve faithfully as a shepherd to other ministers. Well, throughout that time, he was unanimously asked to become the Pope once the Pope died, and he rejected it. He actually said, "No, I don't want to do this." But the will of the people, according to different books and sources, prevailed in that they sort of said, "Look, you are the guy. We want you to do this." Well, as he did, it was an important time because there was a lot of turmoil going on in Rome at that time. Well, he, through wisdom and through a strong discipline of service, helped to unite Rome. Now we see a lot of what he did would later cause a division between Eastern and Western Rome, and yet Constantinople was united through his service. And while he served as Pope, he served in a different way than many of the others. He became known as a servant of the servants of God. He really focused on what does it mean not to lead politically or not to lead with an iron rule. What does it mean to actually serve? And so he wrote a book called Pastoral Rule, which really became more of a textbook in the Middle Ages for ministers. And his intention was for ministers to see themselves as shepherds and servants of the flock. A great challenge to what was going on previously, and a change. Well, through that becoming Pope, he became known as Gregory the Great. And a lot of what we see in the Catholic Church today, first with doctrine, came from him. He believed in purgatory and taught that, and wrote a lot of doctrinal books that they studied during the Middle Ages, and so that's where a lot of the doctrines came from, was from him. And so, whether good or bad, he influenced in that way. The Gregorian chant that many know may not have been invented by him, institutionalized, but it was popularized by him. He loved music, loved that form, and so it became known as the Gregorian chant for Gregory the Great. But he was also very focused on missions, and he helped to not only establish but to push missionary efforts even towards Britain. And so a lot of the, especially with Augustine, a lot of, during that time, mission efforts were started and encouraged by Gregory. So he became known as Gregory the Great, and his leadership as this great pope was very influential for the Catholic Church. Now remember, the church was united at that time. There were no Protestant churches or anything. That would not come for another 900 years. And so in this, the church was heavily influenced by this pope. And that's why I would say he was one of the most important popes, because it influenced all of Christianity and Christendom. So I wanted to share that with you. Maybe you knew a little bit about him, a lot about him. I want to encourage you to study church history, because individuals like this, there are successes, there are failures, there are strengths, there are weaknesses, there are good things that he did. There are some things that we see today that are negative because of his influence. But ultimately, remember, Gregory the First is not the hero of the story, just like David is not the hero of the story. Christ is the hero of the story, and we want to always focus on Jesus Christ. He is our Savior, Lord, and King, and he has invited us to his throne, invited us to his house. We are Mephibosheth. We are crippled and lame, sinful, wretched creatures, and Christ said, I love you so much that I'm welcoming you here. And so remember that, especially this week as we celebrate our risen Savior, that evangelism is not complete until the evangelized have become the evangelists. So let's do our part and share the gospel with the world. I love you. I'm praying for you. Stakes in the ground.